Hello, students. We will have our first lecture of GUID 311 about ancient Egyptian temples. Today we will see how these temples developed. As you probably remember, the temples, the ancient Egyptians, when they settled by the Nile in prehistoric times, life developed slowly. Therefore, during the New Stone Age, they settled and they had more free time. They had time to think, so they started developing small worships, and probably they were worshiping out in the open air. These will develop gradually until the period of the pre-dynastic, which is about 150 years before the dynastic period. During this period, a lot of ideas will develop and settle and become more advanced, if we may say. During this period, the Egyptians had two main kingdoms, the kingdom of Upper Egypt and the kingdom of Lower Egypt. The kingdom of Upper Egypt had a temple that looked like this. As you see, it has mats. This is, of course, a reconstruction, an imaginary picture, a reconstruction with the standards, with the four standards that will continue with us till the end of history, as we will see. This is the temple of Heracompolis, that was the center of worship of the god Horus. This would develop to be built in stone later on in dynastic periods. Here is the area of Heracompolis, as we see it here, to the south of Kena, and this is a head of the god Horus that was found in the temple. Of course, this head is not pre-dynastic, but it dates to the Old Kingdom. This also, during this time, there was also temples in the delta. A lot of the temples in the delta are destroyed today due to the flood and the humidity in the area of the delta. But however, we can see that they had many cities, but the main capital for the kingdom of Lower Egypt was Butu, where a temple that looked like this was built for the goddess Nekhbet, the goddess Wajid, who was worshipped in this temple. Well, here we go. This beautiful shrine is a new kingdom model, or a new kingdom box, actually, of Ushaptis, but we see that it had two sides high and a vaulted roof. This is what is called the Per Nu, or the temple of Lower Egypt. The previous temple we talked about is the Per Wer, or the temple of Upper Egypt, the great temple. After the unification, things will develop, and as we studied in our previous courses, there were temples for the king's funerary temples, there were temples for the sun god, there were sun temples for the kings of the 5th dynasty. However, in our section today, we will study the temples of the new kingdom, how they developed and what happened to them. First of all, I would like to say that we will see the design of the temple, but building a temple for a god was a very important thing. The king had to attend at the beginning and at the inauguration, and the king needed to follow up on the work. Resources of the country would be provided to build this temple. Supervision from the vizier and the king would be carried on all through the building process. Therefore, here we see a list of some of the rituals that were done during the building period of the temple. At the beginning of the temple building, there is a ceremony called stretching the cord. We will see a slide in a little while showing us this. Stretching the cord means to measure the land and mark the boundaries of the temple. This was done by the king and the help of a goddess called Seshat, that we will see her picture. Then the king will purify the area, usually using natron, spreading pattern around the area. He will actually also dig the first, what we call, foundation deposit. Then we will be filling this foundation deposit or foundation trench with sand and with other things we will see in a little while. Then he will make the first brick. Symbolic, just like today we say he will put the brick of foundation. So here he will make the first brick in a mold, and it will later be buried in the foundation deposit together with some of the tools used in the construction, and sometimes just models of these tools. And a most important thing are golden plaques or silver plaques or plaques of any material with the titles and the cartouches and the names of the king who started the building. This helps us a lot to know who is the king who initiated any building. Then the work would start. Then when the temple is finished, the king will return again to purify the temple, then present it to the god who is worshipped in it, and then of course make offerings and sacrifices. Let's see. These are the rituals. Let's see a couple of pictures. An important picture of the goddess Seshat. Here we go. We recognize her. She is the goddess of knowledge, mathematics. She's related to astronomy also somehow. She has a star representing knowledge on her head, and we see her here with the king digging or hitting something to mark the area of the temple, the new area of the temple. We see also the king here, a picture of the king making the brick, the first brick in a mold. As we see here, he will put the brick, the mud mixed with straw, and then leave it to dry and then remove it from the mold. It is very symbolic, and it's interesting because that's the tradition that we still have up till now. Another important thing is here is the king is purifying the temple. The circle around the temple symbolizes Natron. Here is a temple of the god Ammon. So we see here Ammon, and we see a king. It doesn't matter which king, we just want to understand the ritual. And here the king is offering the temple. And then another picture here, after purifying the temple, the king offering the temple to Ammon. These are the most important steps in the inauguration and in the building ceremonies. Now, we were talking about the foundation deposit. We will see a picture of a foundation deposit, but here we see some of the things that were placed in it. Jars, sometimes parts of broken things. As I mentioned, tools used in the buildings or models of them, and the plaques, here we go, that contains names of the king. We see one example here, which is the foundation deposit of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir al-Bahari. We see it was discovered with a lot of things inside it still, and that helped a lot identify. That means that the foundation deposit is not done under the temple, it's beside it, in the vicinity, in the area of the temple. Now, this is a temple, a good example of a new kingdom temple. This, of course, is the temple of Luxor, and we will discuss it in details in our next lecture. But in today's lecture, we will see that here we have the pylons, which are huge towers. We'll talk about them, and then we will see a lot of columns, and we will continue. And we recognize that the temple height is not the same. We will discuss this in our lecture today. All right, let's see. That's a plan of a temple. Although this example dates back to the Greek period or the Ptolemaic period, we actually know that they just followed to a large extent the Egyptian temples. Although there is a standard for the Egyptian temples, I don't think that there are two exactly identical temples in ancient Egypt, as the Egyptians like to add something special in every temple. However, we will see the main elements, which are the pylons. All of these elements we will see in details, but these are the towers that start any building. Outside there is the outer court, and around it there is an enclosure wall that we will see its picture very soon. Then there is what is called the peristyle. the room with side columns, with columns on the sides. As you see here, there is just one row of column parallel to the walls. Now that means that here this is bright light, but also it means that on top of the columns there is a roof, and we will see the function of this roof very soon. This would lead us to another hall. This hall is called hypostyle hall or hall of columns. Sometimes there is more than one. Sometimes there are two. Sometimes there are three. Like for example in the temple of Medinat Habo, 3 hypostyle halls. Usually after the hypostyle hall there is at least one room. The last one before the sanctuary is usually this one here, is usually the offering room. Here we go. Now we see finally we reach to the sanctuary. All around the sanctuary during many times there were rooms usually dedicated to other gods and sometimes used for storage of the most important things related to the god. Like for example the linen that he wears, the golden jars that would be used in the ceremonies, the tools, the incense burner, etc. So all the things used during the worship of the god would be considered sacred and would be stored in these rooms. All right, now as we notice a couple of things that we will highlight in our lecture today, we notice that there is an inner actually wall of the temple, because there is another outer wall which is the enclosure wall. We also notice that from outside the temple looks that it has the same sides, but when we look we will notice that every room has a different size. We will see the reason and details of this as we go. All right, let's see here another plan. It's almost more or less the same plan. With a pylon, peristyle, hypostyle halls, sanctuary and rooms around it, but we can also see a section of this, like a long section showing us the pylon, the halls of the temple leading to the sanctuary. Let's go on and see what happens. We talked in religion, or if you didn't attend the subject, you will attend it with us. We talked that the ancient Egyptians believed that the gods live in the sky. They used to live on earth, but they believed that they moved to the sky. And they believed that the sky has water. The reason why they believed so is that because the sky was blue, and because that it rained sometime. So actually they believed a god must have a boat to move from one place to another. And therefore all gods in Egypt, even the small gods, were shown on the walls if they are moving in boats. Therefore, in any ceremony, the god has to go from one place to another using a boat. That explains to us the existence of such an element, the key. The key is the main port of the temple. That is at the beginning of the temple. The boats of the god during festivals will dock up at this key, and then the priest will carry it from the key to the sanctuary of the god. So that's an important element. We still have several keys found. This is a picture of a key in one of the tombs of the noblemen, showing us how it looked. It always looked like a T shape. At Karnak there are 2 keys of 2 different periods that were found today. Here is the key of the temple of Philae at Aswan. Now, since we passed the key, the priest will start carrying the boat. Well, there is an important element, although it does not exist in all temples, but in a lot of temples, the priests will walk through a procession road. This procession road is called the Avenue of Sphinx. As you see, avenue means a huge, beautiful street, and Sphinx, of course, is indicating that there are rows of Sphinx right and left flanking the road. These Sphinx, they take different shapes. this one is called Sphinx. It shows a head of a ram and a body of a lion, and in our case it shows King Ramses II, because this is one of the statues of Sphinx from the entrance of Karnak temple. However, sometimes they have a head of a man, sometimes a head of a falcon, and even sometimes head of other creatures. Now, in short, we have the Avenue of Sphinx, and then we reach the entrance of the temple itself. There was another entrance on the enclosure wall, and we will see the enclosure wall in a little while. Now we will be standing in the outer court, and then we will step in. There are always steps leading to a higher level. On this higher level, we will see obelisks, we will see statues, we will see doors, and we will see the two towers of the pylon. This is a model, an ancient Egyptian model actually, although has some restoration in it, but it is an ancient Egyptian model of the entrance of a temple. Now, I kept telling you about the enclosure wall. The whole temple in stone would be built in stone, and it would be surrounded by mud brick, a mud brick wall. However, not all temples were built of stone. Later period and Greco-Roman, sometimes the smaller shrines were built of mud brick, but the main big temples of the gods were built out of stone. The reason why the enclosure wall is built of mud brick might be practical, to save the stones, but it also might be because the temple, as we will understand, represents the Benben, the first pyramid, the first mound that appeared out of the water at the creation. However, this mound was surrounded by waves of water, and it's believed that the enclosure wall represents the waves of water. This is the reason why probably it is built not very straight, but looking like the waves of water. And that's another reason why it should be made with a material close to the Nile, like the mud. All right, now we already mentioned that there are obelisks and statues at the entrance of the pylon, or at the entrance of the temple itself, the stone temple. Here is an example from the temple of Luxor. There used to be two obelisks. Now today only one is standing, and then statues, some of them seated and some of them standing, as we will see in details. Then we see the towers of the pylon. Now, when we look at obelisks, we already studied them in a previous course, but we remind ourselves that the obelisk is a symbol of the sun god. It represents a ray of the sun with a pyramid on the top. It's usually used to commemorate the activities of the king and to be dedicated as an offering for a god, usually a god related to the sun, like Amun-Ra, or previously the shorter obelisks that were found from the older kingdom were dedicated to Ra. However, this is a good example from the temple of Karnak, of obelisks. And usually they were provided in pairs, like we see in the picture over there, pairs of obelisks dedicated by Thutmose III to the god Amun-Ra. Here we go. Now we see more details. The Avenue of Sphinx, this one comes from the temple of Luxor, and it has heads of a king instead of a ram. We see two seated statues. There used to be some standing statues. One of them is seen in this picture. Then the pylon, and we notice the holes in the pylon. We will talk about them very soon. Let's see. These holes were functioning for a most important reason. As you see, there are recesses, 2 on each side, making a total of 4. As you remember, we mentioned the Perwer, the temple of Upper Egypt. We already seen a reconstruction of it, or an imaginary picture of it, and we have seen that there were 4 standards. Number 4 represents the 4 corners of the world: north, south, east, and west, according to the ancient Egyptians, that were guarded by gods. And during the days of the feast, there would be 4 flags attached to the pylon, inserted into these recesses. And of course, these poles are very tall and very heavy in the big temples. Sometimes they are about 4 tons each. So to prevent them from falling and causing much problems, they will be attached to the pylon using ropes. As you see here, there are 2 holes to attach the temple by the use of ropes, and this way it will prevent them from falling. It tells us also that the pylon was actually large, and it had stairway and rooms to lead up, so the priest can attach the ropes of the poles or of the standards. Here we go. Now usually the pylon has the scene of a king smiting, or actually he's not smiting, he's threatening to smite his enemies. The same image that we saw on the Narmer palette. He has the mace head and he's ready to punish them if they did not behave, or they did not behave and the king is taking them to offer them to the god of the temple. Usually other military scenes can be found in some examples, but usually that's the picture that we see on the pylon. Here is a good picture of a pylon from the temple of Edfu, but it shows the same thing. The pylon that here we see with details how it has 2 towers, and it has again the 4 recesses, and again the king smiting. And these 2 towers actually represent the Akhet sign, the symbol of the Akhet, or the horizon that looks like 2 mountains with a sun disk shining in between, and that's why we always see a sun disk. If the part linking or the upper lintel of the entrance still exists, it must have a sun disk in the middle. Sometimes they fall, so we don't have them all. Here is a good picture of a pylon. We notice here there are 4 flagstaffs on every side, making a total of 8, because this picture represents the greatest temple of them all, the temple of Karnak, that was so big that needed more than just 4 flags. Here is another picture of Habu temple, a drawing of the temple. Now, once we pass the entrance of the temple, we enter what is called the open court. We distinguish now between the outer court, that is in the area between the pylons and the obelisk and the Avenue of Sphinx, and the open court which is inside the temple. The open court has an open air part, and on the sides, as we saw on the plan, columns that will move around to also be sometimes on the inner side of the pylon. A little roof is found on the top of the space, the area between the columns and the wall behind it. Then we have the hypostyle hall next to the open court. Now, it's important to note that as we studied in religion, not everybody is allowed to the temple. Outside the temple, people can visit and make offerings, but once you enter the temple, the number will start to get more and more limited as you go inside closer to the god. So here in the open court, nobles, the king, the prince, the queen, the high priest, and other priests are also allowed in here, and then as we go inside, this number will be minimized. Alright, here we go. Following comes the hypostyle hall. And the hypostyle hall of the temple represent the marshes of papyrus, the swamps of papyrus that grew around the benben when it raised out of the water. So we must remember that the temple reflects the benben, and it also reflects the universe. It symbolizes the universe. It is also a symbol of where the god lives. So this is why temples are called Het, and Het means house. So they refer to the temple as the benben, as the place of the god, or as the house of the god, as well as the symbol of the world, where the world started. So it's not unusual to find areas of the temple open air, areas of the temple dark, areas of the temple with water, and areas of the temple with trees. That's what the columns represent. They represent trees or plants or papyrus or lotus, any other plantation. Here are some shapes of columns. Open papyrus, closed papyrus, and stems in here. Okay, so that is what we see. Papyrus, also palm, lotus, and papyrus. However, there are some exceptions, like the columns with the head of Hathor. Okay. Now, it's interesting. The hypostyle hall, especially of Karnak temple, has a special feature. Has a wall with has many columns, and has these columns not on the same level. Some columns on the sides are on a lower level. Here we go, right and left, and some in the center, the two rows in the center has a higher level, which makes the roof of this part higher than the roof of the shorter columns. This way it will create space, and in this space we have windows, and those windows are to have some light enter the room. This has to do with the lighting system in the temple. The outer court, the open court is bright, the outer court is brighter, and as we go in we will start to have it darker and darker. So here we have a roof. In the open court we only had a small roof on the side columns, and this roof has some windows, so it's not totally dark. Now there is a reason for that. We will discuss very soon. Here we go. Now we see here a temple of Medinet Habo from the air, where we see the pylon, two open courts. What used to be hypostyle hall, we can still see the columns, 3 hypostyle halls, and they used to be roofed. And then the inner part is the sanctuary and some side chambers, as we mentioned, for the gods and other things. Now, finally we reach the sanctuary. As you see, we have been proceeding and it was getting darker. Now once we reach the sanctuary, it is almost dark, except for small windows to allow very little light to enter the sanctuary. Now why is the God in the dark? To enable him to see the people outside, but he's in the dark, no one can see him. This is one reason for it. Also, we notice now that the room is small, not like the open court, not like the hypostyle hall. Actually, if we go back to the previous slide, we will notice that the temple actually gets narrower. So here is the first court. Now the second court is smaller. The hypostyle halls, actually one of them is bigger than the one next to it. So as we go inside, the rooms will get smaller. If you see this narrow space here, that's the sanctuary. Also, I told you that we step into the temple. Actually, as we move from one room to the other, we have steps leading us to the sanctuary. So actually, this is what the temple looks like this. All the way to the sanctuary, the floor is getting higher, also the roof is getting lower, and the walls are getting narrower. This is to give us the shape of the temple with the sanctuary at the end. The sanctuary at the end represents the top of the pyramid, because the whole temple represents a pyramid. And of course, the top of the pyramid is where Atum started life, when he was changed from the form of the Benu bird to the form of the sun, and started building and creating people and creating life on top of this. But this is why the sanctuary is the smallest room in the temple. Okay, here is another sanctuary. It usually has a pedestal to put the boat of the god, and sometimes it has a shrine to have a statue of the god. Here is a statue of the god. A statue of the god represents his image, represents his presence on earth, but it is sacred because it's related to the god. And statues of the god were made out of gold sometimes, especially for Amun-Ra and other important gods, but sometimes were made of other different material, and in most cases gilded. This is an example of a sanctuary. And another example of a sanctuary, and this time we see a pedestal for the boat, and we see a granite shrine to house the statue of the god. Here is more details about what we were talking about. The plan of the temple. High pylon, high hypostyle hall, lower next hall, lower roof for the next hall, all the way until we get there. You probably noticed there are steps leading from one room to the other, again showing us the idea of the temple. Well, that's the main stone temple. Within the enclosure wall, there are other things, nilometers, sometimes other things, but the most important thing is the sacred lake. This one had some trees growing in it, but actually it used to be filled with water, and as we see, there is the outer wall. The sacred lake represents the place of water on earth, the primeval ocean where life was created. It was used also for the priests to wash and to use water for rituals. Now, finally, we see that the Ramesseum. We see that that's the pylon, that's the temple, quite destroyed, but it's good enough for us to see. And also it's interesting that that's the size of the temple, where my hand is, and all of that is the size of the workshops of the temple. Now, the workshops of the temple are to serve many things. Are to serve, like, for example, here we have sets of kitchens where they would make bread, they would make beer, they would make the food for the temple. They are interesting kitchens with bins for trash, or like baskets for trash, with ovens, with open area above the ovens to let the fumes go away. Very interesting and very organized in rows and kitchens facing each other. Now we also have other workshops. Some temples were provided with a place to make wine, and some were provided with workshops to make gold, to make silver for the tools and the jars of the temple. Also sometimes they were provided with places to make chariots and other things. Also we have the stores where the food would be stored, where the storage area for the temple would be. And not all temples had such a large workshop area, but Ramesseum was an important administrative center at the West Bank, like Karnak was on the East Bank. So that's why it's bigger than usual. All right, that's a good picture here from a tomb of a noble, showing some of the activities, gold being weighed, jars of gold, bows and arrows, chariots, different industries that would take place inside a temple. That's all about the temple. We discussed in our lecture the development of the temple. We discussed the rituals of building the temple. We discussed the importance and the symbolism of the temple. We also discussed the architecture of the temple and the religious idea behind it. See you in our next lecture. Hello, everybody. In today's lecture of GUID 311E, we will talk about the city of Thebes, and we will talk about its history and importance. Now, before we start talking about Thebes, we'd like to see where is it located. Thebes is located, as you see here, about 700 kilometers south of Cairo. It is in Upper Egypt. It used to be in the province of Qina, but today it is in an independent province called the province of Luxor. And of course, it was a great city. The greatness of this city must have started by the 11th dynasty, when the kings of the 11th dynasty during the first part of the 11th dynasty, during the first intermediate period, had to go and fight the kingdom of Heracleopolis of the north, with the capital in Egnatia, because the Heracleopolitan kings were dominating the part of Lower Egypt, while the Theban governors were actually controlling several nomes in the south, to the south, all the way till Elephantine, or to the north of Elephantine. This is why we don't call them nomarchs, we call them monarchs, because each one of them was actually king of a small kingdom. However, Egypt was divided during this first intermediate period, and the kings of Thebes tried to unify, the monarchs of Thebes tried to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. We have Entef the first, Entef the second, Entef the third, until we have Montuhotep Nebhepetra, who managed to unify Upper and Lower Egypt, making the city the capital of the united Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, what happened to the city before that? It existed, but it was just another Egyptian city with not much fame and importance. It will start to gain its importance from this time. The ancient Egyptians did not call it Thebes or Luxor, but they called it Wasit or Was. Wasit comes from the scepter. The was semper, that has a jackal head, and it was a symbol of power of the city. This is what happens to the city of Thebes. However, later on, the Greeks called it Thebes. Most likely they called it Thebes after the famous city of Thebes in Greece, that we will see its picture very soon. Here we go. This is the city of Thebes in Greece, and this city was big and famous and had many monuments. So when the Greeks visited Thebes, they found that it's similar to their great Greek city, and they called it Thebes. However, there is a theory, not proven, we don't actually know for sure, that the name Thebes is derived from the word Ta-Opet, the land of the Opet, which is the festival of the Opet. Well, later on, the Arabs came to the city of Thebes, and when they came to the city of Thebes, that, as you see, is located on the Nile like this, they found that the city has so many large temples that we will study in our course, Karnak Temple, Luxor Temple, and they were fascinated by the city. They thought that these temples are palaces, so they called it Enclosure, which means the palaces. This is the name that later on we pronounce as Luxor. These are some of the names of the city, but as we will discuss the history of the city became so powerful and famous that sometimes it was only called the city. So in ancient Egyptian they called it Newt, or sometimes they called it, they also called it Iyun Shemait or Iyun Resit sometimes. Both Shemait and Resit means the south, and Iyun refers to Heliopolis, the city of Iyunu. So it is Heliopolis of the south, Iyun Shemait or Iyun Resit. These are some of the names that the famous city carried. However, we already mentioned how it became important during the 11th dynasty, when King Montuhotep Nebhepetra unified Upper and Lower Egypt. During the 12th dynasty, the kings of the dynasty, especially King Amenemhat I and his son, moved the capital to Ithitawi. However, the city would remain an important religious center, or the important religious city of Egypt. We will see about that in a little while. This would be followed by the second intermediate period, where Egypt would be weak and divided, and also it would be occupied by the Hyksos. For the second time now, a family from Thebes will come and reunite Egypt. It is the family of King Ahmose. Seknen Ra, his son Camus, and his son Ahmus will lead the war against the Hyksos, and Ahmus will manage to expel them out of Egypt. Again, the family came from Thebes, and this makes Thebes the famous city that it is, of course, and an important city because its kings liberated Egypt from the foreign invasion. And again, they will use it as a capital for the country. So once again, the capital will be on the east bank of the Nile in Thebes, and the burial places will be on the west bank of the city. This is a little bit about the city and how it developed, and also we need to understand that this development, political development, would not be alone. There is another religious development. We studied in religion the god Ammon, and we mentioned how he was a god of the Ugduat, the hidden, the invisible. But then later on, this Ugduat god would change in nature, most likely in the 11th dynasty, when he would be merged with the god Ra to create an Ammon Ra. This Ammon Ra god will no longer be the hidden god, but he will keep some attributes of the hidden god, but he will become a sun god with the attributes of the sun god. He will become a powerful king during the Middle Kingdom with his family, the goddess Mut, the god Khonsu, and they will make the Theban triad. Later on in the New Kingdom, when the Ahmus unified Egypt and will start the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom, Ammon-Ra again will raise to importance. This time, great importance with the expansion of Egypt and the change from a government of a kingdom to a government of an empire. And the god of the kingdom will become the god of the empire. So Ammon-Ra will gain so much fame and importance. His priest will have so much power that the temple will be filled with wealth, and that the priest will be so powerful that they will later on control political decisions. Now, all through this time, Egyptians had to glorify this great god. So in the city itself, which is on the east bank of the river, palaces of the kings and the queens lived there, and the nobles had houses over there, and the rest of the people of the city lived there. And also we have the workshops, beautiful recreational areas, and we will have many activities like any big capital have. But the most important buildings would remain to be the temples of the gods, like Karnak temple and Luxor temple, that were connected together by a great avenue called the Avenue of Sphinx. Now, on the west bank of the city, there would be the necropolis. It existed from before, from the Old Kingdom, and then from the Middle Kingdom, and then of course will continue to be used actually, but the oldest monuments that we have date back to the period before the Middle Kingdom, the first intermediate period. We have here the famous areas of the site: the Valley of the Queens, the Valley of the Kings. We also have the tombs of the nobles, we have the workman village, and we also have temples, funerary temples of the gods. As we mentioned in our previous lecture, the temples will be separate from the tombs, and therefore the temples are built by the plain on the edge of the desert. And here we see other things that added to the fame of the city. Now, this is here a map of the West Bank with all the important highlights. All of these are tombs and temples of kings, of queens, of nobles, of prince, and even of the workmen who lived in the village of Deir el-Medina and served in building and cutting all these tombs. This is what makes the city one of the most famous and most visited cities around the world. Well, It's important. It has important buildings, important governmental buildings, but it also has important religious activities. So, how to link the East with the West? Egyptians invented an interesting ceremony, a festival called the Beautiful Feast of the Valley, where the god Amun-Ra and his family members, Mut and Khonsu, will leave Karnak temple, will cross the river, will go and visit all the temples of the kings, and will end up in the temple of the ruling king, and then will return once again to the city to visit the rest of the city and to go from Luxor temple to Karnak temple once again. A very important festival that all members of the country, of the city, participated in it, and during this time a lot of interesting activities took place. This is today just a summary about this great city that was one of the world's great cities that many people visited in ancient and in modern times. And when Homerus, the Greek author who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, visited this city, he actually was fascinated by it, that he called it the 100 Gated Thebes. Thank you, and see you in our next lecture.